It is indeed my pleasure to introduce to you Kevin Miller, the Executive Director of the Ohio Rehabilitation Services Commission, a position that he was appointed to in January of 2011. Since that time, he has helped to launch Recovery to Work, an innovative partnership with the Ohio Department of Alcohol and Drug Addiction Services and the Ohio Association of County Behavioral Health Authorities, adding employment counseling services to help the state's battle against opiate addiction. Director Miller began 17 years of state government leadership experience to his position at RSC. He was the executive director of the Ohio State Board of Cosmetology beginning in 2005, began his career with the Ohio Department of Youth Services in 1993, where he became the chief of staff. He is a member of the National Autism Society, the Shamrock Club of Columbus, and the president of the Mark Young Peter Memorial Scholarship Fund. He is a former member of the West Jefferson City Council. Director Miller received his bachelor's degree from Ohio Dominican University here in Columbus and a master's degree from The Ohio State University, also in Columbus. I have had the great pleasure to get to know Director Miller much better over the last 4 months. That's something I've enjoyed very much. We've had the opportunity to learn, I think, quite a bit from each other. We're both very excited about the partnerships that have been created by the Rehabilitation Services Commission and our boards. That's something both he and I are committed to. In fact, we're going to have an event in June for all of the counties that currently participate in that program and all the counties that are interested in participating in that program. And Director Miller is committed to be there that day with many members of his team so that we can continue to grow the services that we offer. So please join me in offering a very warm welcome to Director Kevin Miller.
Well, good morning, fellow advocates. That's a great introduction, and it's a shame I have to follow up and have to explain. Usually someone says, "Did he say Director of the Board of Cosmetology?" And my mother-in-law still to this day says, "Can you get me some scissors?" Because she's a cosmetologist. I go, "No, I didn't cut hair, Carol." But what is great about being an advocate, when Dan says he's been in this for 13 years, I have a feeling he's been doing it for a lot longer. And because when you find out that you have a calling to do something like this, as I'm sure all of you feel the same, you certainly don't get into this for the money. You get into this because it's something that touches you. And just to build on what Dan had indicated, it's been a great journey to not only get to know Dan, but many of the members of the OACB and their passion for wanting to help individuals with disabilities. And I tell you, you guys can't have a better leadership than what you have with Dan, so send the check when you're done, Dan. But no, I mean that. I'm going to make just a few brief remarks because everybody's really here to hear from Commissioner Ruttledge. And as well we should. I'm just pleased that I could be of service here in Ohio. When we talk about focusing on transition, and I know former Commissioner Ruttledge has a passion for this as well, and with what OACB is doing with bridges, I think you could see that we're really building the right type of roadmap here in Ohio. Because when you look at the types of strategic numbers that are coming back and you see that the sooner we're able to make a difference, the better off that individual is going to be later in life. And we're committed to that, and we want to make sure that that grows. With the Employment First initiative, I just want to tell you a quick story. And Dan was at the event that was held here just in another suburb adjacent to this one in Dublin, at a hospital where there's a program that RSC has with Ohio Health where they have individuals who are working at Dublin Methodist Hospital. And the governor signed the Employment First initiative. And the governor, for those of you who don't have the privilege, and trust me, I say that tongue-in-cheek, to sit in cabinet meetings every Friday, this governor is all about results. And so the governor is sitting next to me and John Martin, and we had a young man named Micah who actually dotted the I in the governor's signature when he penned the Employment First Initiative, is working full-time at Sam's Club and is making about $10 an hour and doesn't miss work, and his supervisors are pleased to have him there. And the governor leans over to me, and I look at him, and he's got tears coming down his eyes, and the governor says, "I don't know if I can get up and talk." It was so powerful of what he saw. And of course, he got up and he did talk, but the first thing he said was, please forgive me if I babble through this, because it's very powerful to see, the types of impact that we're having with people who need help. And he said, there's a lot of things that people say about me as governor, but one thing I am committed to is helping those who need help. And that Friday at the cabinet meeting, you usually don't want to be pointed out. Director Martin will tell you in cabinet meeting. But he pointed out Director Martin and I, and he said, "I just want all of you to know in the cabinet that that event was the single greatest thing I've done in my administration." So I think that speaks volumes as to what type of commitment here in Ohio we want to have from our governor, and also our partnerships with DODD, RSC, and all of you who make things happen where the rubber meets the road. So I think there's nothing but great things ahead for all of us when it comes to advocating and getting people to work. Enough about off my soapbox here. Let me get to the point when it comes to why everybody is here. I have some nice things here to say about Lynnae Ruttledge, but I just want to say something from me personally. When I was appointed to this position, I was having a son with autism. You learn after you have to accept the fact that you have a special needs child, which I will tell you was not an easy road for me to do. My wife, who's a saint, jumped on board rather quickly. I was your typical angry father, blaming everybody under the sun. If you've seen that scene in Parenthood where they find out their son needs help and Steve Martin stands up, she smoked grass in high school, it's her fault. No, my wife never smoked grass, but I was trying to think of, she was raised on a farm, there must have been pesticides or something. But then you realize once you get to the acceptance level, which took me some time, you realize that then you become committed to what you want to do the rest of your life. This is what I want to do the rest of my life, is advocate. And Lynnae Ruttledge has done that her entire life. You're talking about an individual who's done it all from the state of Washington, her leadership with the vocational rehab services for over 25 years. She was a teacher. And then she really wanted to be a glutton for punishment and went to Washington, D.C., and was the commissioner for RSA. And I had the great privilege right after I was appointed by the governor to go visit with her. And I told her one of the things that we really were struggling with in Ohio is this wait list. And she had a little sign in her office, which I loved, and it said, "Wait list," and it had a circle with a line through it. And I said, "Well, it's good to see that you look at that too." And she's compassionate and she's hard driving. A woman of her stature, she gets things done. And I can tell you, it's been a pleasure to get to know her over the last couple years. And you can find no one greater when it comes to championing those with disabilities and what it means to push that agenda forward. So please put your hands together for Commissioner Lynnae Ruttledge. Oh
Well, first of all, everybody's taller than me, so I always have to move the microphone down. But it's always kind of embarrassing when people are so generous with their comments. And I'm really glad that Kevin started with, people have to ask why someone who'd been the director of the cosmetology board would be chosen to be the commissioner for RSC. That was a question we had in Washington, D.C. as well. But we also knew that he came with a heart, and his heart was because of his son, and that his commitment was around employment of people with disabilities. And make no bones about it, when we look at what it takes to be successful in the field of vocational rehabilitation and independent living, we look for those individuals who come to their jobs with that commitment. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be here. But it's always sort of like, oh my gosh, there's all these things people say about me. And I remember a lot of it, but I think I did smoke grass when I was in high school. And so I forgot lots of that stuff. So most of you have not had the honor of listening to me before. I really am the person that stands before you. I take very seriously the work that we do together, but I don't take myself very seriously. And I'm hoping that as I give this plenary session presentation, I'm going to prompt you to think differently about some things. I'm going to prompt you to question the approach that you're using. I'm going to really prompt you to think about what can we do together to increase employment and independence of people with significant disabilities. I think that when I was invited, it was because you're at that cusp of being one of those first states to be able to enact a governor's executive order around employment first. And I was asked to come and speak with you because my commitment is to competitive integrated employment. And I never make any bones about that. I have worked in community rehabilitation programs. I've worked in programs that have, for a very long time, been committed to their work with people with disabilities, but not necessarily to employment outcomes, and not necessarily to competitive integrated employment. And so when I come to you today, I am unabashed about what I believe to be the right direction for us, the right direction for people with significant disabilities, but more importantly, the right direction for businesses to hire people with disabilities. So I want to just kind of paint a picture with you and prompt you to think about what's it going to take to be able to increase employment and independence for individuals with significant disabilities here in Ohio. But I want to start with why it's important for me to even be here. I would not be here without the state of Ohio. Now you have to kind of go, but she's never lived here. I grew up in Michigan. My parents eloped to Ohio. I wouldn't be here if you didn't exist, because they couldn't get married in the state of Michigan. My mom was 17, my dad was 20. They didn't have kids for another 7 years after that, but they wanted to be married. And they couldn't get married in the state of Michigan because my mom was still in high school and underage. So on October 19th of 1940, they decided that they were going to drive to Ohio and they were going to get married. Now, they weren't living together. They both lived at home. And so it's kind of urban legend in our family. They either got married in Toledo or Bowling Green. I'm betting on Toledo because it was closer, but my sister's convinced that she heard people talking about Bowling Green. So one of my jobs now that I'm retired is I'm going to be calling the county seats to get marriage records to figure some of this out. Because my parents and my grandparents have all passed away, so I don't have those documents and I don't have those people to ask anymore. But being a person who grew up in Michigan and grew up in the Detroit area, coming to Ohio was always really special to me because my husband and I spent our honeymoon at Put-in Bay. How many of you know where Put-in Bay is? Lake Erie, right? Okay. We would routinely call in well to go to Sandusky, to go to Cedar Point. To us, being able to come to Ohio was a part of how I grew up. Now, I also grew up knowing the chant of, "Oh, how I hate Ohio State," but My husband told me I couldn't tell that, but he doesn't listen to me when I give these presentations, so I still include that. We are longtime bicyclists, and I've done TASERV many times, and TASERV is this very, very difficult bicycle ride that you do. Actually, it's going to be this Saturday and Sunday, and you leave from Columbus and you go down the River Valley and come back again, 105 miles each day. Now, I haven't done that since I was like 30, which is a long time ago now. But Ohio to me is a part of how I grew up, and it's a part of what I know around Midwest values. And so when I was invited to come and speak with you, it just made a whole lot of sense for me to be able to do that. So please accept my thanks for the invitation to come and talk with you. You've got some great leadership in the state of Ohio. And part of the work that I've done with the Rehabilitation Services Commission with both Director Miller and with Susan Pugh has been around how do you take the charge of increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities and make that work in a real challenging environment. And in Ohio, like many other states, financially it has been a very challenging environment. But having a person who is your VR director, who sits at the cabinet level, is a real sign of confidence, and it's a sign of commitment to really increasing employment for people with disabilities in Ohio. So I was really glad to have a chance to come and make this presentation. But it's not just Kevin and Susan. It's people like Tim Harrington. Tim Harrington has been known in the disability community for probably 25 years when he did this great video called The 10 Commandments. And so he's up in Toledo, his guy with a disability, and his video literally helped change the approach that employers used as they thought about hiring people with disabilities, because they do the whole thing with the 10 Commandments. And they talk about what are the things that you need to know about dignity and respect in working with people with disabilities and understanding how to be able to speak effectively about the abilities of people with disabilities and how to be able to use the voice and the presence of someone with a significant disability to be able to deliver that message. And that's what Tim Harrington does. Tim and I both serve on a national advisory committee for mentoring, and it's part of a think tank called Policy Works. And Policy Works was started by Susan Daniels, who's a woman with a significant disability who worked for the Social Security Administration and recently passed away. And she, as her legacy, wanted to assure that college graduates with disabilities got jobs. And what she knew from the work she did in Social Security and the work that she'd done as a consultant is too many times people with significant disabilities complete high school, complete college, have great academic credentials, but lack the opportunity to become employed. And part of what she knew to be the answer was internships and mentorships. And so she really committed the last part of her career and the last part of her life to working at the national level to bring attention to employment of college graduates, to make sure that they were not only academically prepared, but that they had the opportunity to use that academic preparation and be able to have careers. And so Tim Harrington and I both serve on the National Mentoring Advisory Committee for Policy Works. We also have people like Linda Wetters and Mark Seafarth, who have been a part of the National Council on Disability and have helped to move the whole conversation around employment of people with disabilities forward. I had a chance to be here in Columbus last year, almost exactly a year ago, for an employment summit that was held at Goodwill Industries, to be able to look at what will it take for your state's leadership in the public and the private sectors to move an agenda forward on employment and employment policy. So I had a chance to be able to be a part of that. You've got a very strong presence of the National Rehabilitation Association. So whenever I talk about the NRA at home, my husband looks at me and goes, NRA? You mean the National Rifle Association is investing in people with disabilities? I'm going, no. NRA is the National Rehabilitation Association. And you've got some great leadership here in the state of Ohio who are actively engaged in making sure that professional rehabilitation counselors, both in the public and the private sector, have a robust membership association to continue to have the best possible skills to not only deliver services to people with disabilities, but to collaborate with you at the county level, at the service delivery level, in assuring that people with intellectual disabilities become employed. So I set that context because it's somewhat disingenuous for you to have to sit for an hour and listen to someone who's giving a plenary session who doesn't even come from Ohio. But my roots are in the Midwest. My husband and I moved to the Pacific Northwest in the mid-1980s because we were really tired of shoveling snow. And they said to us, you know, it rains a lot. And we kept going, but you don't have to shovel rain. There's a whole new context now. I think you do have to shovel rain. When you live in a rainforest and it rains a lot, it does feel like you have to shovel rain. But we moved from the Midwest to the Pacific Northwest. But both of our families are still in Michigan. So it's really an honor for me to be here. I've always started every presentation I've given over the last couple of years when I was appointed to be the commissioner for the Rehabilitation Administration, to start by saying thank you. The work that you do at the county level is incredibly important work. It's not easy work. It is where the rubber meets the road. You work daily with local decision makers, whether they're from business and industry, or from local government, or community nonprofits, or state agencies, or the schools. You're working every day out in the community. And you have a responsibility to be responsive to the needs of the voters in your counties and those who are funding the services that you provide, to make sure that when you're delivering services, they're of the best value possible, but that you keep in mind always the values that you have and that you hold dear about employment of people with disabilities, independence of people with disabilities, and supporting families of individuals with significant disabilities. So the work that you do at the county level and the collaborations that you have at the local level are critical to the success of all of us. And so I wanted to first start just by saying thank you to you and to tell you that it's a privilege to be here. And having just retired actually in January, to get ready to come and speak again was really exciting to me. It kind of lost its excitement after a couple of years, because when you're traveling all the time and you wake up and you go, so like, where am I? Or where am I going next? I've had a chance to be able to think about why it's important to come and speak with you here in Ohio. And I appreciate having this opportunity. You're one of a pretty small group of states that have now taken that leap to have a governor's executive order for employment first policy. And employment first is, it seems like a new term, but it's what we've always believed to be the direction that services need to go, in that we would always be thinking for working age adults that employment should be our priority. But you all deal with the realities of Medicaid funding. You deal with the realities of inconsistent messages over a long period of time from CMS, from the Department of Education, from the Social Security Administration, from you name the federal agency, you name the state agency, you name the local agency. It's not like we ever sat down together and said, let's make this a really effective system. I think what we did was we said, let's make it look like spaghetti, and we have all of these systems that support people with significant disabilities. And what we've come to believe is that the best possible way to make sense of all of that is to start with a philosophy and a statement of purpose that says that you place your priority on employment first. And at a national level, and I'm going to get to this towards the end of my presentation, but at the national level, what we understand is that we need to always be thinking of the end in mind. And so when we're thinking about employment, then what will it take for our systems to work better together and for people with significant disabilities to get better outcomes? And we believe that starting with the philosophy and starting with a priority on employment first was the best national policy, and you're identifying at the state level, it is the best state policy. Now, it's very similar to what we know will happen when, at an international level, we have a UN convention on the rights of people with disabilities. That convention required a lot of work at an international level and for countries to sign on as signatories. But the real work comes when you implement and when you ratify that piece of legislation. So the United States made the commitment early on to sign the UN Convention, but they have not yet ratified. You're at a very similar place in Ohio in that you've now had a governor's executive order and you have a task force that's been put together that needs to come up with some very specific activities in the next 6 months to be able to lay the groundwork and the framework for implementing that policy. So I really encourage you, as you go through the sessions today and tomorrow, to think about what will it take, not just to have your governor sign an executive order, but what will it take to implement it? When you still have all of the challenges with 24-hour care, with transportation, with employers that don't necessarily embrace employment of people with significant disabilities, with family members who don't necessarily embrace the concept of employment, when you live in rural areas and you don't have transportation for people to be able to get to work, you still have all of those challenges, but you've started to lay the framework to say, for people with significant disabilities, especially for people with intellectual disabilities, your priority is on employment first. And so part of what the work that will be done over this next 6 months is to say, how will we do that? What are the key pieces that we have to have in place to be able to make that work? And I'll be giving a question and answer session after this to talk a little bit about what have I seen in other states, and how can you go about that work in a way that you will be able to effectively implement what is now the policy and the statement by your governor of what the priority is. When you think about what will it take to increase the employment and independence of people with intellectual disabilities in Ohio, I have been characterizing the way to approach this is with ABCD. What I know about all of us is that we do a lot better when there's some kind of catchy title or some name to an initiative that you can remember. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go with ABCD. Maybe it's because I started out as an elementary school teacher. But it's really about using all of us, not just those of you who are in this room, but the counselors that work at RSC, the educators who are in classrooms every day with people with significant disabilities, with businesses in the local community. We have to all be committed to asset-based community development. Now, it's a term of art in the way economic development is used and in sustainable communities, but I want us to think about how do you translate that to what that means for employment of people with disabilities. As a person who was born with their disability, I have, for my entire life, had people make decisions about my capabilities based on how I look. Not necessarily knowing my education, not necessarily knowing my skills, not necessarily knowing my strengths, not necessarily asking me about my interests, but making assumptions based on how I look. Now, when I was in college and I wanted to become an elementary school teacher, I was sent to a small community in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan because I went to Northern Michigan University, to do my student teaching. And we went in a car with several other teacher wannabes, and we went to a school district, and we all had interviews with the teachers that we were going to be assigned to, and we went and looked for places to live, and we came back to campus. And when I was called into the student teacher placement office, I didn't think anything of it until they said to me, well, Lynnae, you're not going to be able to do your student teaching in that community. But we found another community for you. I was pretty clueless at 20, and I didn't think that it had anything to do with my disability. I just thought there were a lot of us all being placed in the same community, and that there was going to be another place that I was going to be able to get my student teaching assignment. So they assigned me to a school district where I would work with the principal, and I would live right across the street from her, and that when I went to meet her and to meet the family that I was going to live with, the principal looked at me and she said, well, you don't look so bad. And that's a true story. Her perception of me was shaped by what was told to her by the placement office of why I had not been selected in another school district. It was based on how I looked. Now, hopefully we've made huge amounts of progress since then, but I'm here to tell you that still happens every day with people with intellectual disabilities. Assumptions are made about what they can and can't do based on how they look, based on what the perception is about what they're going to be able to do. And so rather than use a deficit model of thinking about all the things that someone with an intellectual disability can't do, my recommendation to all of us is to use ourselves as asset-based community developers. And I'm going to walk you through a series of different interactions, and I'm going to ask you to think about what will it take for Ohioans with significant disabilities to be able to become employed from many different contexts. And the first one is really for them themselves, for people with disabilities. What will it take for them to be viewed as contributors, as employees, as people who are one of the few groups that actually want to pay taxes? Now think about that. In your local community, do you hear a lot of people talking about, I want to pay taxes? No, not usually. But people with disabilities, when they have the power of a paycheck, can and do pay taxes, and they want to do that. And so I encourage us to think about what will it take for us to have people with significant disabilities be viewed as contributors, as employees. Not just that they come with unique skill sets. The people I know with significant disabilities have to problem solve every single day. They have to problem solve if they have a spinal cord injury, are their attendant care needs going to be met? If they're a person with an intellectual disability, is the bus going to come? If it's a person who's blind or who's deaf, are they going to have the interpreter services, the reading services that they need? And they problem solve continually, and they always have to think about contingencies, about, so if this doesn't happen, this can happen. Well, you bring those unique skill sets to the workplace, and there's a person who's valued for their contributions. And they're viewed as bringing something uniquely different to the workplace. And I encourage you to think about when we do job development and job placement, we do job covering, we do customized employment, many times what we're looking at is the unique skills that this person can bring to the workplace. And then how do you create an employment opportunity? How do you identify the right employment opportunity for that person to be successful? So what are the assets that a person with disabilities brings to that workplace? For many people with disabilities, when they can't get a job, they're encouraged to go and volunteer. Now, think about that. In some ways, that's an acknowledgement that they should be doing something with their time, but many times that results in an abuse of their skills when indeed they could be employed. But taking it from the purest context, when a person does volunteer, they may then be able to have more on their resume to talk about why from the time they graduated from high school or got their diploma or got their certificate to having their first job, what did they do during that time? And volunteering, excuse me, in many instances is one of the ways that we build those resumes. We can also do that with internships. We can do that with work experience. But for many individuals with significant disabilities, finding their niche in the workplace comes because they've tried many different things. And if we're using that asset-based approach, then we're going to ask ourselves, what are the environments where this person can be more successful? There's a young man in Spokane, Washington, with significant intellectual disabilities who has been an AmeriCorps member for the past year and a half. And one of the things that he did in his AmeriCorps assignment was that he worked for the ARC of Spokane, and he developed a curriculum that he then presented in local schools for emergency preparedness for not just people with disabilities, but for everyone in those classes. And so he used his approach of knowing and understanding what a person with a disability needs and translated that to a curriculum that was of critical importance to all of us. I mean, how many of us have a personal emergency preparedness plan? Well, John was able to go in and work with schools to be able to develop that curriculum and then be able to use that with Centers for Independent Living throughout Washington. We have the context of assets when we think about people with significant disabilities being advisory board members. It's not just having a person who's there as a figurehead, but if you're a person who relies on public transportation every single day, then your contributions when you're sitting on a advisory committee for not just special transportation, but for regular transportation, you can talk about whether or not you've been treated with dignity and respect. You can talk about whether or not you can figure out the bus schedule. You can talk about what are the things that people with disabilities can bring to the table when they are users of that transportation service and then are viewed as good members of the advisory committee. There's a portion of our law in the Rehabilitation Act that says we have to have a state rehabilitation council, and the majority of members on that state rehabilitation council have to be people with disabilities. So we value the input. We believe that they bring assets to that environment where they can tell us whether or not the services they received were timely, whether or not they were of benefit to them. And they can help us think about ways to improve our services. And so as advisory committee members, whether it's for transportation, recreation, independent living, vocational rehabilitation, human rights commissions, those are all environments where people with disabilities can be viewed as assets. And what our responsibility is to think about having that as a part of our community developer hat of how do you bring the significant talents of people with disabilities to those environments. People with disabilities can be more successful in secondary education if during the time they're in high school, they've had internships and work experiences. We know in the state of Wisconsin that 80% of the internship opportunities that they created for people with disabilities using their Recovery Act funds resulted in people becoming employed full-time. So what's our approach when we look at what the expectations are for students with intellectual disabilities? In the state of Washington, we were using the, again, it's those phrases that people will always remember. So we had jobs by June. We wanted to make sure that students with intellectual disabilities had a job by the time they left high school. And so it was jobs by June. We also looked at initiatives of jobs by 21, making sure that at the time that someone turned 21, that they would be employed. So what's our responsibility of helping educators see the assets that students with intellectual disabilities bring and having them be more successful as they leave school? And what will it take to have that happen? I'm assuming that the program you talked about at the hospital is Project Search. Project Search is one of the most powerful models, and it was established right here in Ohio, in Cincinnati at Children's Hospital with Aaron Riley. And they developed a program that said, here are ways that we can be employer-focused and employer-led and build environments for people to be able to spend a year, an academic year, doing 3 rotations of internships with a commitment that they're going to be employed by the end of that year. In the state of Virginia, there's actually competitions between employers who are part of Project Search to have more of their graduates employed at the end of their internships. And you can go on to YouTube and see some really powerful graduation ceremonies where folks talk about what the difference is in the workplace when they've identified ways to see the assets that people with significant disabilities bring to that workplace. If you go to thinkcollege.net, you'll see a variety of college programs, both the 2-year and 4-year college programs, that are including people with significant disabilities in academic programs. And suddenly you have this whole thought of someone with an intellectual disability could go to college. They could have the environment of a college, they could have classes on the campus of a college and be in inclusive education. I recently did a keynote address with a transition conference. And so 500 people like this, probably 2/3 were students with disabilities and their parents, and the other third were educators. And when I asked folks, as we got started and people were sitting down and I walked around and talked to folks, I met this one group of students who were all in high school, but they were having their high school classes on the campus of a college. And I started talking to them about what the advantages were. And so they were involved in internships. They were involved in college programs. They had a chance to be able to see their future as something beyond high school. So when I was talking to this large group of people, I said, so how many of you students have been involved in internships? And very few hands went up, except the group that had their classes on a college campus. I said, so how many of you have had a job, had some work experience? Again, very few hands, but the kids who were on the college campus had all had those experiences. And so then I changed the question. I said, so how many of you have been involved in Special Olympics? Every hand in the room goes up, right? And I said, so why can't we collectively find ways that students who have been engaged in Special Olympics can have that same kind of engagement with employment? Why can't we translate what people have learned in Special Olympics, in Best Buddies, to be a part of their curriculum to becoming employed? We've invested a lot as a country in the concept of recreation and competition and what the values are of Special Olympics, and people get that. We need to take that one step farther to say, what will it take for all of those young people who have now been engaged in Special Olympics to look at how does that translate to being motivated, being committed, being driven, being parts of teams, wanting to excel, learning that sometimes you win, sometimes you don't, but that you're a better person as a result. And so I just encourage you to think about what will it take for us to rethink our commitment to activities like Special Olympics, which is a great activity that has a lot of community recognition, and translate that to the skills and the abilities and the assets that people with disabilities bring to the workplace. Most of the young people with disabilities that I know are much better at social media than I will ever be. They understand Facebook, Twitter, they get it all. They are actively engaged in learning to use technology. Those are incredibly important skills for the workplace of today and tomorrow. What are we doing to make sure that they understand the responsibilities with that? How many of them understand that when you put a picture up on Facebook, an employer might look at that and make a decision about whether or not they want you to be employed in their business? So I think there's some challenges and some opportunities with the move that we're all making towards social media. What's it going to take for students who have intellectual disabilities at the high school level, at the college level, in their first jobs, to think about how can they be responsible with learning to use social media? And that's part of, when we're going to do asset-based community development, those are the skills that people are going to need. So that's a lot about people with disabilities. What we know is that they generally live in families, and that moms and dads and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers and second parents and all of those people that are a part of their lives have a huge influence on whether or not people with intellectual disabilities are going to be viewed as assets. Kevin and I were talking before we got started, and part of the challenge I had at the national level was to talk with large community-based programs who had an incredible dollar investment in maintaining facilities that had four walls and maintaining their place in the community, but didn't necessarily see employment of people with disabilities as community-based, as competitive, integrated employment. And so when we talk with people about the choices that they make, many times it's guided by their moms and their dads. And those family members who have an incredible amount of influence over people with disabilities and what they think their future will be. We were challenged by the Senate Help Committee to think about what would it take for more high school students as they left high school with an intellectual disability to not go to a sheltered workshop, to be competitively employed, to leave high school and go to a job, to have the community supports necessary to support them in the community. And the pushback that I got from community providers and from a lot of family members was that they weren't ready to go there. That for many reasons they were making decisions to maintain the programs that they had and to not necessarily think about conversion of those programs. So most of you know that the Administration on Developmental Disabilities has now funded programs in 6 states to be national centers of excellence, to be able to look at a program of significant importance of figuring out how do we assure that more individuals with intellectual disabilities are involved in competitive integrated employment. And so my encouragement to you in Ohio is to look to Iowa, to Wisconsin, to California, to New York, to the 6 states that got those dollars, to be able to think through, as you implement an employment first policy, how are other states approaching that? And what are some of the strategies that they're using? And again, in my session after this, I'm going to talk about some of the other states, and one of them is Wisconsin, and how are they approaching that? But working with family members, Sharon Lewis and I would go and talk with large groups of family members who really had many, many fears about employment of their sons and daughters, and were using their power as a parent to influence the direction of their sons and daughters. And what we talked with them about was, when we talk with your sons and daughters, and when Sharon talks to her daughter, what she hears is, I want to work. I want to work at McDonald's, mostly because I want to eat at McDonald's, but I want to work at McDonald's. There was a young woman who's deaf who applied for a job at Gap, and the employer and the managing supervisor were really concerned about how are they going to employ this young woman who was deaf, and what about communication, and is this really the right decision to make? And they had lots and lots of fears. Well, what they didn't remember was that this was a young woman who was probably 17 going on 18, and she had a lot of friends. And so when she got her job at Gap, guess what? The sales in that shop went up because all of her friends came, and their family members came, and they're buying more clothes at the Gap because that's where they want to invest. They see that as their community development. They have a choice. They could go to Macy's, they could go to Nordstrom's, they could go to Kohl's, they could go to so many other places, but they would go to the Gap because they had hired this young woman, and her friends knew that. So how do we translate the fears that family members have into ways to view this as an asset? In the state of Washington, in Clark County, we developed a project search site, and rather than having it at the local hospital, we had it in county government. And it was a great exercise in figuring out, if you're going to talk this talk, you got to walk the walk. And so they had to identify the jobs that people could do in the county government structure. And one of the things that was compelling was when they did a video of a young man as he left home and got on the bus, took the bus downtown, and went to work. And very much like Kevin's story about the governor, you can see the family members with tears just coming down their cheeks going, I never thought my son was going to ride the bus. I never thought he'd be able to do that by himself. And he is able to do that. And so I really encourage you to face those fears with family members and think about what are the assets. They know best the strengths and the preferences of their sons and daughters, and how do you translate that to what someone can do at work. For service providers, what we've known is that utilizing supported employment and customized employment costs less than sheltered services, and that the outcomes for people with significant disabilities have increased. And so how do you engage with the service providers who are generally your contractors to talk with them about changing the way they view the assets that a person with a disability brings? And it's not necessarily to continue the support of that organization, but to translate that to working in the community. One of the things we found in the state of Washington was that we had to focus on staff training, that we had a lot of job developers who essentially would go to local employers and beg them to hire someone with a disability and say, well, you just have to hire them for a couple of hours a week. And what we got down to was you have to fundamentally shift the way you think about how you represent a person with a disability to an employer. And you can't say to Children's Hospital in Seattle, Washington, that you really are only looking for a part-time job for this person, because that employer needs full-time workers. And we needed to spend and invest in our staff so that they have better skills in being able to do job development and job placement. APSI, which is a great membership organization, has now developed a certification program for job developers. And we're looking at how to be able to have that certification, not just for community providers, but also for VR staff who are doing job development, job placement. So you have a common criteria of what people need to be able to do to be good at being job developers. If you switch gears and think about the only thing that really matters in all of this is, are you going to get employers who are going to hire people with disabilities? It really doesn't matter if you've got really well-qualified, motivated people. It doesn't really matter if you've got the transportation all lined up, you've got child care taken care of, you've got all of those issues covered. If you've not addressed what will it take for employers to hire people with significant disabilities. Now, I think that the world has come a long way. I don't think that I would have difficulty getting placed as a student teacher as I did when I started my career. But people with intellectual disabilities face that discrimination day in and day out. So part of what we know to do is to think about the champions within those businesses. So you have Kevin, who's a champion, not because of his background in cosmetology, but his background as a parent. And you would go to Kevin and you would talk about the kind of environment where his son is going to be successful. And so if you have a son with autism, you know that there's some environments where it's going to be really challenging. And it's probably not the kind of job development that you want to do. But if you look at the places that Kevin's son brings his assets, then you look at what can you do to help talk with an employer about the assets that your job seekers with disabilities bring. And how can you look at employers and businesses as being a place that Voc Rehab uses for community-based work assessment, that community providers use for evaluations, for assessments, for job development, for job placement. And you go to those businesses that you know are going to grow. One of the things that strikes me over and over again is that I'm now over 60. There's a lot of my age group that now requires goods and services that I never thought about until I did turn 60. But the whole healthcare industry, the aging industry, those are growth industries, and they need workers. And what are we doing to approach those growth industries about the talents and skills of people with intellectual disabilities. We've got some great models with Project Search, and there's other models throughout the country. And what can we do to make sure that when we're talking with employers, that we identify who those champions are? So are they part of your business leadership network? Are they involved in activities that engage them at a social level with people with disabilities? In the state of Washington, when I was still the VR director, we had some amazing folks in Olympia, which is where I lived, which is the state capital, who were getting really good jobs in state government. They were getting jobs, and these are individuals with significant disabilities, as the executive director of the State Independent Living Council or the State Rehabilitation Council, but they also had supported employment jobs in government. And what we did is we wanted to find a way to celebrate their employment. So we created a business after hours networking event called Say Hey. And every quarter, we would bring together people that had recently gotten jobs and recognize them and celebrate with them. We also used it as a place where businesses and hiring managers who were looking for talent could stand up and say, I'm looking for a diesel mechanic, or I'm looking for a paraprofessional in a legal office, or I'm looking for someone who can do bus cleaning at the inner city transit, whatever that job was. And we would have people with disabilities who were seeking jobs who would say, I just finished a program at Goodwill Industries in office skills, and I would like to work in this kind of environment. And we actually had job matches that happened at Say Hey. We had a person who really wanted to work for a managed care association up in Tacoma, and had had no luck at being able to get through to the right people. But they knew that's where they wanted to work. Well, at Say Hey, they were actually able to talk with the human resources manager from that particular organization, and through that, then competed competitively with other people and got the job. We had people at Social Security Administration who really want to hire people with significant disabilities, who would come and say, these are the jobs we have available, and we need people to apply for them. And then the next quarter, we would find out what progress they had made. It was the only time in the almost 5 years I was the VR director that we were actually, for good news, on the front page of the newspaper was when they covered one of our Say Hey events. I really encourage you to think about how do you engage differently with businesses in your community to have them help you celebrate and increase employment of people with significant disabilities. For state agencies, as a person who has worked in mental health and in vocational rehabilitation, and worked as partners with the Substance Abuse Agency, with the Housing Agency, with the Human Rights Commission, what we knew was that there were ways that we could help them identify what were their needs and how could people with significant disabilities meet those hiring needs. But those state agencies, especially in Voc Rehab, we want to make sure that there's places for community-based work assessment and for work experiences. And I told you the story about Wisconsin. They've invested in internships, and 80% of the people who completed their internships went on to full-time employment. We don't have an 80% success rate in most instances, but when you use internships, we found that we did. We know that Voc Rehab is a major component of the workforce system and can leverage the relationship they have with the governor and with the other members of state workforce boards to increase that focus on employment of people with disabilities. Use those to your best advantage when you think about how do you see asset-based community development when you work with a state agency at the local level. For educators, it's a really long process. Having worked in the Department of Education, change does not come easily to the Department of Education. It doesn't come easily to local school districts. It doesn't come easily to the curriculum for special educators. But when we were able to implement Project Search in Virginia, and we partnered with an educational institution to do research, we then had an evidence-based practice that we could share with our field. And what we found was, if you had a whole group of special educators, and we would go to their mega conference, and rather than have me do the presentation, we had the employer, we had the worker with a disability, we had the local school district person, and a VR counselor, and they all talked about how they viewed the success of something like Project Search. And it changed people's thinking about what was possible. So again, my challenge to you is, what will it take in Ohio for educators at the secondary level and at the post-secondary level to think differently about their investment with working with people with intellectual disabilities and to achieve better and different outcomes? There's a school district in Nebraska that has they've identified that they will have a significant shortage of people in the skilled trades. And they know that they're not getting as many young people coming into apprenticeship programs or staying in apprenticeship programs. And we looked at how could we encourage young women with disabilities, especially those with learning disabilities, to think about becoming engaged in the trades. So rather than approach it with cosmetology, what we said was pizza, pop, and power tools. So we brought this whole group of kids together. The first year there's like 30, and then there's like 80, and now it's up to probably 250 young women with disabilities who come for a day, and they get the pizza and they get the pop, but they also get to try out power tools. And for them to then see themselves in a trade was an incredibly powerful way of saying, you bring assets to the workplace, how can we translate what you're good at into a way that you can think about your career? So at a national level, please know that there are federal agencies who are committed to making change happen. Many of you have read the policy statement that came out from CMS, where they said the priority is employment. It took them years to come up with that one sentence, because for so long they had said, well, you know, if you're involved in supported employment, you can't be involved in VR, and there's like all kinds of craziness that went on. But now we've got CMS, who issued a policy statement that said the priority is on employment. Your governor's executive order talks about the fact that, is it 6%, Kevin? That only 6% of your resources go to employment? Right. So if you haven't read the governor's executive order, you really do need to read it, because one of the things that it really strikes home for me is that you've got an investment that happens, but when you have, whereas Ohio's developmental disability system currently spends less than 6% of available adult service funding on placing and supporting individuals with developmental disabilities in the general workforce, you've got a lot of room for improvement. So I'll just leave it at that. The Department of Justice recently issued their statement of concern and interest in the state of Oregon. And what they've said is they view individuals with intellectual disabilities who are in children workshops who could be employed in the community as a potential Title II issue. So Title II is a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act that talks about state and local governments. And so if you have resources that are going into sheltered employment, when indeed those individuals could be employed in the community and are barred from that activity, that could be an issue that the Department of Justice is taking a look at. So there's a lot of stars that are aligning. We have a president who made a commitment more than a year and a half ago now with a presidential executive order. Seems like everybody's big on executive orders, but with a presidential executive order that said in the next 5 years, the expectation was that 100,000 more people with disabilities would become employed in federal government. And so he set the bar, not only saying that's my expectation, which had also been said under the Clinton administration, but he said, and I'm going to hold federal agencies accountable for their hiring. And so he's now asking for federal agencies to say, in the hiring that you're doing, how many individuals with disabilities have you hired? And he wants to make sure that we not only set the goal and set the expectation, but that we then have the data to be able to say what's actually happened in response to that executive order. We had Tom Harkin. How many of you know who Tom Harkin is? Tom Harkin, great senator from the state of Iowa, longtime advocate for employment of people with disabilities. A person who was appalled to find out in his state at Henry's Turkey Farm that individuals with developmental disabilities were living in congregate care there at a facility that was owned and operated by a business, and individuals were working day in and day out at Henry's Turkey Farm, and they were making less than minimum wage. And the Henry's Turkey Farm hadn't even had their certification from the Department of Labor renewed for like over 10 years. So they had an obligation to be employing people at and above minimum wage. And they're now going through the process of identifying how to be able to make sure that that employer honors their obligation to those employees to pay them at and above minimum wage for the work they've been doing. So Tom Harkin was embarrassed that that happened in the state of Iowa. He was concerned that people were being abused, and he was concerned that it was an employer environment and a business environment that was not reflective of what he believed to be the values of Iowans. And so he translated that to a challenge that he took to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce just about a year ago now. And he said, right now we have about 4.2, 4.3 million people with disabilities employed every day. I want to move that bar up to over 6 million. And I need your help to be able to do that. And he challenged the Chamber of Commerce to think about, by 2015, how to increase employment of people with disabilities by over 1 million people. So he thought big. He thought with the big picture in mind, and he laid out that challenge to the Chamber. And the Chamber accepted that challenge. I would encourage all of you to go back to your local chambers of commerce and ask them to talk about how they're going to help make that happen, how they're going to be a part of the solution of how to increase the employment of people with disabilities by over 1 million people by 2015, because that was something that the Chamber of Commerce agreed to. So I think there's a lot of ways that we collectively can work together. What I would encourage is that you think now about what can you do. It's not enough just to listen to me, who I wake up every day excited about this. I spend my thought process thinking about this. I spend a lot of time talking with people about this. But the bottom line is, what can you do? So as you go through today and tomorrow, you're going to have a lot of sessions where you're going to hear from people about solutions to issues that are important here in Ohio. But to me, there's nothing more important then identifying what you can do to increase the employment and independence of people with intellectual disabilities. So if you think back to what can you do differently with the people that you serve? What can you do differently with the family members that you work with day in and day out? What can you do differently with service providers, with your contractors, with the folks who are delivering the services? What can you do differently with educators? What can you do differently with businesses in your local community so that at the end of the day, when you look back at Ohio being one of the first states to sign and to implement an employment first policy, that you're going to have the strategies in place to overcome all of the barriers that people will tell you are there, and I know that there are. But at the end of the day, what could you do differently to impact the employment of people with disabilities? There's a national campaign. How many of you have heard of What Can You Do? Oh, nobody. Oh, so it's like a new audience. Okay, so what you want to do is write down www.whatcanyoudocampaign.org. Literally, whatcanyoudocampaign.org. And if you forget, I'm a master at Google, and so all you have to do is just put in the term, what can you do? And up will pop this website. And they have downloadable public service announcements. And they have materials that are already developed about saying to audiences, whether it's an audience of people with disabilities, an audience of employers, an audience of key decision makers, what can you do to impact the employment of people with disabilities? One of their videos we used, the public service announcement we used at Say Hey in Olympia. And what we did was we showed it at a business after hours event with the Chamber of Commerce. They were our co-sponsors for Say Hey. And we showed them this, it's probably 3 minutes of segments of people with significant disabilities doing a variety of different jobs. And they talk about what can you do to increase the employment of people with disabilities. So you have a young woman who's deaf and she's a wheelchair user and she teaches young children. She's an elementary school teacher. You have a young woman who came back from the war. She's a disabled veteran, and she talks about bringing her skills and her talents to the workplace. You have a young man with developmental disabilities who works for the DC DD Council, and he's a great motivational speaker. And he is one of the presenters. And it shows you people that you can connect with, and then it challenges you to think about, what can you do? We won't get anywhere unless we encourage ourselves, the people we work with, and our community members to really think differently about the assets that people with disabilities bring to the workplace every day. So I encourage you, and I thank you for your absolutely wonderful receptiveness to my presentation today. But think about yourself as asset-based community developers. Too often we think about the deficits. It's time to think about people with disabilities and their assets. Thank you very much.